This video is from chapter 14, which is a relatively short chapter that concludes the textbook. However, I also bring in material that was not covered when we discussed the chapter 13 on politics, the material related to social change in political movements. I do go over some of that material as well as add additional material here in this lecture video. So this chapter opens up with a reminder about how the gender binary exists despite it not being real, and how the consequences of it are often unfair and it impacts us all. I really like that a C. Wright Mills quote is provided because by referring back to a well-known sociologist, the sociologist that we have to, thank for the concept of the sociological imagination, it really encourages us to consider, how does sociology help us see and respond to this gender structure that we have in our society, that we probably have spent a lot of time just thinking of as being innate or natural, but hopefully as we get to the end of this class, you are learning to see that it is not. And so when you think about how sociology can help you respond to this, two primary ways, obviously, the sociological perspective and imagination, which encourages you to think about the relationship that exists between you and larger society, your personal biography and larger social history. And then, of course, that distinction between troubles and issues, right? So in addition to that, the author has some pretty concrete suggestions, and I don't really have a lot to add here, so I'm just going to highlight what the authors say. Consider tossing your gender binary glasses. That quote from page 391, don't forget the basics. All differences are average differences with a great deal of overlap. Men are not all alike, and neither are women. Differences and similarities are caused by the intersection of nature and nurture, not one or the other. And science shows that we are more alike than different. So, just step away from thinking that there are these hard binaries or these perfect truths, particularly about entire groups of people. Think about how you want to interact with others. Remember, there are three options when it comes to being gender policed. Push yourself to consider when it might be worth it to embrace that third option, right? When you actually confront the policing. You can police the policers. And then, of course, just, try to personally opt out of gender policing yourself. Don't do it to others. And then don't direct that type of energy back on yourself as well. Reflect on your relationship with the institutions around you. So this is chapter 8, which is, of course, the other chapter that, you're reading out of order for my class. But gendered institutions push us to make gendered decisions while also making these choices seem natural or inevitable. Some institutions, the ones that are in flux, make it easier to get around them than those that are more entrenched. But just keeping it at the forefront of your mind that just because something is entrenched doesn't mean that it might not be in flux in the future. The fact that change is possible, and in fact, change is inevitable, is a big theme that I'll be returning to later in this short lecture. Remember that the mechanisms that produce inequality aren't simple, right? That hierarchy of men, and that and that especially, so that men are ranked in regards to their masculinity and how close they are to that hegemonic masculine ideal. And of course, that can change over their lifetimes. That can change based on the different contexts that they find themselves in. Intersectionality, which of course complicates our understanding of gender by introducing other social identities that impact our gender strategies, that impact how we see ourselves, that impact how other people see us. And then, of course, just resist those common misconceptions about feminist progress, right? The idea that it's linear, that it's, that it's achieved all the success that it's going to achieve, or that it's achieved all the success that's even necessary. The mechanisms that produce inequality aren't simple, which means that the solutions to push back against that type of inequality isn't going to be simple as well. And then finally, know that change is always possible. The rest of this lecture video is going to be about how do you impact change. But before I go a little bit more deeply into that additional social movement material, just consider the author's suggestions. Pick a battle or two. You will exhaust yourself if you feel like you have to fight all the battles and be on all the front lines. There are topics and issues that I care about more strongly than others that I commit my time, my energy, my financial resources to, because those are my battles. It's not that I necessarily think that other battles and other issues aren't important. And I hope that those other issues are taken up and adopted by people who feel as strongly and as passionately about them as I feel about the issues that I am most passionate about. But you can't fight all the battles, and you can't fight the battles all the time, which, the authors also conclude, aim for balance in your life. But when you are ready to battle, when you are ready to fight for change, what exactly do you do? And now I'm going to go over that social movement material, because change is possible. And when we talk about social change in sociology, we're referring to a shift in the characteristics of culture and society. It can be alternation, a modification, or transformation of public policy, culture, or social institutions that happens over time. And oftentimes, a lot of this social change is brought about through social movements, because social movements are a large number of people who come together in a sustained, organized effort to bring about or resist social change, right? That is the point of their existence. That is the objective of their being. Oftentimes, because they are, seeking to enact change in this way, these are usually people that lack access to political power. People that participate in social movements are oftentimes people who are, if not disenfranchised by the system, are at least not key political players. These are not part of the power elite, to use another C. Wright Mills term. And so when you think about what makes up a social movement, oftentimes you might think of things like protests, which are usually the most visible activity, because this is how people, individuals, groups make their demands and make them known. Boycotts. This is a way of pressuring the system to respond to those demands. And then some social movements also contain, civil disobedience, right? Where people break laws in order to make a point. Key thing to kind of keep in mind about that concept of civil disobedience is that, it's oftentimes, not necessarily supposed to be violence or anarchy or rebellion, right? It's strategically disobeying some laws in order to make a point, usually about lack of equality, lack of inclusion within the system itself. Some examples of social movements, obviously the great historical example that students often, can think of is the civil rights movement. A more frequent or more recent movement would be like the Dreamers, Occupy, thinking back just to like within the last couple of years. After I even have made these slides, you've had your Black Lives Matter, and your, movements around racial equality. So social movements are a way in which people can enact social change, particularly when they're not politicians and they don't have a lot of political power. why do people participate in social movements? There are two concepts that are relevant here. There are the people who participate because they will benefit directly from that movement, and we call those people beneficiary constituents, right? They're participating in the movement because if the movement is successful, they will benefit. So African Americans who participated in the civil rights movement are beneficiary constituents. The other uh, type of person who participates in a social movement are people who care about the cause, even if they don't directly benefit from that cause. And so, if you're thinking about the civil rights movement, and we call those people conscience constituents. So in the civil rights movement, maybe some of the white Southerners who did participate in the protests and the boycotts and the marches, along with African Americans, they would be considered conscience constituents. So you have your beneficiary constituents and you have your conscience constituents. And why do these social movements arise? People come to identify with other people similarly afflicted. They're like, hey, we share similar problems, and people are more likely to then participate, or we see the world in a similar way. They're more likely to participate in this type of activism if they've had prior contact with movements, if they are in social networks that support movements, if they have personal or family history of activism, if they lack practical constraints. This is important, if you have a really big family, if you have a really busy work schedule, if you have really limited financial or time resources, it would be difficult for you to participate in protests, marches, boycotts. There are some practical constraints on people's time and resources. And then the final reason, a sense of moral rightness. And certainly for people that are conscience constituents, this is one that comes up the most often. Even if it's not something that directly benefits them, it is the sense that they are participating in something that they think is the right thing to do. Now, obviously, not everyone participates in the social movement, even if they are people who we would consider to be beneficiaries. And so there's a bit of what we call a free rider problem when it comes to social movements. These are people who avoid the cost of activism. They don't expend the time, the energy, or the resources, but they still benefit from its success. Because, if you are part of that beneficiary population, if the movement is successful and changes enacted, you're going to benefit from those changes, even though you were not one of the people that actually participated in the movement. And this is just a problem that all social movements have to face. And so this is specifically from your chapter 13 from your textbook. So now we're going to apply the same kind of discussion about social movements specifically to the women's movement, and the discussion of the waves of the women's movement. So, the first wave largely related to suffrage, but, also education, also drunkenness. A lot of people don't realize that the Prohibition movement actually kind of was very much aligned and entangled with some aspects of the suffrage movement. A lot of a solid percentage of the suffragettes were also, took part in the Prohibition movement. They were interested in maternal and child welfare. A lot of feminist and women's organizations began during this time period. And this is actually when the initial draft of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, actually was written. Now, the second wave of the feminist movement or the women's movement is the wave that usually people associate with the term women's movement, because this was in the late 60s and the 70s. Focus there, ending gender segregation and discrimination, particularly in higher education and employment sectors. There were even more women's organizations founded. A lot of them were autonomous, which means they functioned independently of men's participation and approval. although there was a big push during this time to ratify the ERA, there was a backlash against the feminism. And it was worth noting that that backlash was at least publicly associated and spearheaded with women who were not supportive of the women's movement, not supportive of the ERA. And another way we can see this backlash during this time is that the US initially refused to sign the United Nations statement in support of gender equality, and that was in 1979. So the third wave, your textbook marks it as beginning with the Anita Hill testimony and Clarence Thomas confirmation hearing. There's some debate about exactly when did the third wave begin, as well as when did the third wave maybe end. One way you can kind of determine, like, hey, is this a third wave interest, is because the topics of interest, the focus of the third wave, a lot of it was about pro-femininity, the idea that gender expression and doing gender in your own way. There was the beginning focus on sex positivity, at least among some segments of feminists. This was also the wave where there was a clear acknowledgement of multiple feminisms and the importance of intersectionality, which your book discusses, the rise of intersectional feminist activism. It's not that women of color were not participatory in the earlier waves, but they often were sidelined. Their interests were ignored, their voices were muted. The third wave made a concentrated effort to not just be more inclusive, but to also begin to center the experiences, the voices, and the leadership of these intersectional feminists. And then there was an increasing use of technology to bring about awareness and change. And so obviously with the rise of, technology, particularly social media, you have some forms of boycott and protests that become possible. And your book talks about #activism as an example of that. And then finally, we come to the fourth wave. So the textbook acknowledges the likelihood that we are experiencing a fourth wave now. Sometimes you don't really know you're in a wave until the wave subsides, and you can kind of look back and be like, oh yeah, that was a wave. There were some clear issues and some clear themes that were being focused on and fights that were being had at that time. Sometimes it's hard to really really appreciate that and to acknowledge that when you're in the midst of the wave. And so your textbook addresses how activism in this wave has been both assisted and harmed by new communication technologies. Also addresses, the concerns related to how governmental policies related to nationalism and authoritarianism are impacting, issues related to gender. And then a major theme is the concern over the role of corporations. And so I have a whole slide of that. The concept here is the corporate co-optation of feminism, right? Taking actual social movements and political activism and turning them into advertising slogans and campaigns, right? So instead of it now really meaning something, it now just seems like a tagline and an ad meant to get people to kind of buy goods and participate in this large, global capitalistic kind of system, which, oftentimes those goals and objectives are ultimately at odds with the actual goals and objectives of people, people who are participating in the movement. And so there are past examples of this, this isn't new. People wanting to capitalize on this, you go girl, women run the world energy, Virginia Slims, L'Oreal. Your book talks about present examples Dove, Girl Power, SheEOs. And like I said, the main issue here is just with this corporate co-optation, you're taking something that is meaningful in the social movement, the activist world, and by turning it into an advertising tagline, and monetizing it, you certainly risk trivializing it and kind of stripping it of its deeper meaning. Another concept that comes up in your textbook's discussion of contemporary challenges to feminism is the rise of individualism. And on one hand, it's not that there's anything explicitly wrong with individualism, but particularly for groups that have been disenfranchised, social movements are based around the idea of collectivism, right? Of collective action. If you're only interested in yourself, if you're only interested in how something affects you or your own success, you're not going to be interested or committed to a movement where the focus isn't on whether one, two, or some percentage of the group is doing well. It's really focused on how is the group as a whole being treated. And so it raises that question that your book discusses. Can women only progress at the expense of other women? There are certainly women doing better now, particularly in the world of business in the corporate sector. But at the same time, of course, women have higher rates of poverty, which we've talked about, the feminization of poverty. We talk about the wage gap, but the wage gap for Black women and Latino women is much higher than white women. And so, if you're only focused on how you're doing, as opposed to being focused on, the collective and what your book calls civic awareness, then this is going to impact your likelihood to be active, to embrace, to support social movements related to the betterment of the group. And so finally, the author's final suggestion, I'm jumping back now to the textbook material from chapter 14, is to enjoy the concept of vertigo. And, this is a Reisman concept. And it's discussed on page 395. This idea that, when things are in flux or things are in changing under your feet, it's like this sense of vertigo, and you can freak out about it, and you can push against it, and you can be upset about it, but this really isn't going to change the flux. So enjoying the vertigo, finding ways in which you can still enjoy the experience of existing in a society where things are changing is key here. And so the chapter ends with this, what I feel like is a great quote: "Radical ideas are only ideas that haven't been accepted yet. So go ahead and imagine the unimaginable. The future is yet unwritten."